There is a wardrobe in the back bedroom that nobody has opened in 11 months. The family knows it is there. They walk past the door. They do not touch the handle. Inside, his shirts are still on their hangers, 8 of them, evenly spaced, the way he had always hung them, sleeves forward, collars buttoned to the second button, a brown cardigan on the hook to the left, 2 pairs of trousers folded over the rod, right leg first, crease sharp. His winter coat, a dark wool charcoal, hangs in the back, where the light does not reach it. His good shoes on the floor beneath, toes pointed slightly outward, the leather beginning to dry and crack from the closed air. The widow told me this during a follow-up visit. She had not described the wardrobe in our initial meeting. She mentioned it obliquely, the way people mention the thing they most need to talk about. She said she could not explain it, only that the room felt different from the rest of the house, heavier, quieter in a way that was not silence but something underneath silence, and that sometimes late at night when the house settled and the street outside went still, she had the sense that if she stood outside that door long enough, she would hear something from inside. She was not a superstitious woman. She was a retired school teacher. She had been married for 41 years, raised 3 children in the faith, gone to Mass every Sunday without fail. She had been trying in the only way she knew how to hold on to what she had lost. I have seen versions of this case more times than I can count. The details shift: a husband, a wife, a parent, a child. But the structure does not. A person dies. The living cannot release them. And in that refusal to release, something goes wrong. Not always. Not in every house where someone keeps a dead man's shirts on their hangers. But often enough, in enough cases, with enough consistent features, that I feel obligated to speak about it plainly, whatever discomfort that causes. What I am about to describe will sound strange to ears formed in the modern West. I've spent more than 30 years in this work, trained in the Thomistic tradition, formed under Father James Labar, working within the framework the Church has maintained since the Roman ritual was codified in 1614. For 400 years, the Church provided the laity with specific prayers to address situations in their homes that they could not explain. Most parishes stopped teaching them after 1965. Now, they have all been compiled into a concise, practical guide. Keep it near the door and read the first page tonight. You will find the link to get the book in the description and in the first pinned comment. I speak from case files and from the long discipline of theological study, not from the internet, not from popular spirituality, not from a desire to produce any particular emotional response in you. The details in any case I describe are composite, generalized from multiple situations, anonymized because pastoral discretion requires it. But the pattern itself is real, and it is more common than anyone is admitting, and it has a name, and the Church has a response to it. My name is Father Chad Ripperger. I am a Thomistic philosopher, a Catholic priest, and an exorcist. I have been doing this work for a long time, and I need to tell you what I have seen happen to the living when they refuse, genuinely, materially refuse to let the dead go. The family first came to me not because of the wardrobe. That came out later in the way important things do. They came because the youngest daughter, 17 years old, had begun behaving in a way her mother could not account for and could not address. The girl had been quiet since her father died, understandable. Grief in the young takes different shapes than grief in the old. It is less practiced, less contained, and it often goes sideways in ways that look like behavioral problems or adolescent rebellion before anyone thinks to look deeper. But what this mother was describing to me was not the quiet sadness of a grieving teenager. It was something else. The girl would sit in the kitchen chair that had been her father's, the one at the head of the table, the one nobody else used anymore, for hours at a time, not reading, not on her phone, not doing anything, just sitting with her hands flat on the table and her eyes on the wall in a way that her younger brother found frightening enough that he had started eating his meals in the other room. When her mother spoke to her, there was a delay, not a teenager's distracted delay, but something measured, as if the words were traveling a long distance before arriving. When her mother insisted, when she pushed through that delay and tried to have a real conversation, the girl said things her mother could not recognize. She told me this with great precision, because she was a precise woman. She said the words were too deliberate, too sure of themselves, too old, like they were arriving from a place that had already thought the matter through and was not interested in being questioned. The daughter had stopped going to Mass 3 months after her father's death. She said she did not see the point. When her mother pressed her, she said, and the mother repeated this to me word for word, because she'd written it down in the days after she said, "He is gone. Nothing anyone does will bring him back. Prayer is for people who cannot accept things as they are." I listened to this and said nothing immediately, because what that sentence reveals, if you understand the framework, is not adolescent grief. It is a theological position, a specific theological position, that the dead are simply gone, that the soul does not persist, that prayer for the dead is wishful thinking. And a 17-year-old girl who had been raised in the faith, formed in it, whose parents prayed the rosary together every evening, does not arrive at that position through simple grief. Something put it there. The mother had blessed the house 6 months earlier with holy water she brought from the parish, not the lax form. She was specific about this, not just a sprinkle at the door, but a full room-by-room blessing with prayer, the way her own mother had taught her. She wore a brown scapular enrolled at 22. She kept a crucifix above the front door and an image of Our Lady of Fatima in the hall. She was a woman with what I would describe as genuine foundational piety, not a specialist in spiritual warfare, not someone who thought much about the demonic, but a woman with the baseline of Catholic practice intact. And still something had gotten in, which told me the entry point was not a gap in her own practice. It was somewhere specific, somewhere in the house. And when she stopped at the end of the hall outside that door, St. Thomas Aquinas wrote more than a dozen questions on how fallen angels operate. Most Catholics have never read one line of it. This archive gathers that teaching, the 1,614 rite, and 4 centuries of documented cases into a single reference. Read it slowly, 1 chapter a night. You will find the link to get the book in the description and in the first posted comment, and said quietly, "He is still in there." I knew where the entry point was. She did not mean it literally, or not entirely. What she meant was that she had made the room into a reliquary for his living presence, that she had preserved inside it every material trace of him she could, that she could walk past the door and feel him there in a way that the rest of the house no longer offered. The wardrobe was not storage, it was a site of continuous return. I stood at the door for a moment before she opened it. The room was cold, not dramatically cold, not cinematic cold, no breath visible, no frost on the window, just a few degrees lower than the corridor in a way that was difficult to attribute to the ventilation, given that the house was uniformly heated, and this room had no external wall that would account for the drop. The light was flat, even though the curtains were open, and the afternoon sun should have been in the window. The air did not move. His clothes hung exactly as she had described. Shirts at even intervals, cardigan on the hook, the winter coat in the back, his good shoes on the floor, toes out, a leather belt coiled on the shelf above the rod with the buckle turned inward the way he had always set it. She stood in the doorway and her hands were at her sides, and she did not go in. I understood what I was looking at, not with the dramatic certainty of a detective, not with the professional confidence that the movies give to these scenes, with the careful provisional discernment that the Church's process requires, moving from natural explanation inward, eliminating the ordinary before naming the extraordinary. But what I was looking at had the features I had seen before, the cold with no natural explanation, the daughter's change in behavior localized in time to the months after the room was sealed, the theological precision of the things the girl was saying which had not come from her, and the sense in the mother unspoken and only half conscious that the room was occupied. What she had created was not a memorial. A memorial points outward toward heaven, toward God, toward the hope of reunion in Christ. A shrine holds. A shrine stops time. A shrine is a claim made in matter that the person belongs here and not there, with us and not with God. And the spiritual world is not indifferent to that distinction. I want to explain this carefully because this is the doctrine that underlies everything I am about to say. And if I do not explain it precisely, the wrong lesson will be taken from it. Thomas Aquinas, in the Summa Theologica, questions 50 through 64 of the Prima Pars, works out a careful account of the angelic nature, which is also the demonic nature in its fallen form. Angels are pure intellects without bodies. Their influence on the material world works through secondary causation. They do not create effects from nothing, but they move secondary causes to produce effects. They work through what already exists, through passions, through wounds that are already open, through attachments that have become disordered enough to function as a channel. The demonic does not begin with a full assault. In more than 30 years of this work, I have rarely seen a case of possession or serious obsession that did not begin with something smaller. An opening. The enemy, as the first letter of Peter says in chapter 5, verse 8, "Be sober and watch, because your adversary, the devil, as a roaring lion, goeth about seeking whom he may devour." Goes around, he looks. He finds the opening that is already there and applies pressure to it. Jean-Marie Vianney, the curé d'Ars, who died on the 4th of August, 1859, spoke often about the enemy. He called le grappin, the grappling hook. He said the devil does not come in through the front door. He does not need to. He hooks what you are already clutching, and what this widow was clutching with both hands for 11 months was the material presence of a man who had left the material world. In that clutching, she had created AA of spiritual gravity, a weight of disordered attachment fixed at a specific point in her house that the enemy had found and wrapped himself around like a vine around a post. Padre Pio of Pietrelcina, who received the stigmata on the 20th of September 1918, visible wounds corresponding to the 5 wounds of Christ, which remained for 50 years until his death, said in his letters to his spiritual director that the enemy's most effective tool is never the temptation you can see clearly. It is the wound you have stopped looking at, the grief you have decided to keep. Dr. Richard Gallagher, the Columbia-trained psychiatrist who has spent years consulting with Catholic exorcists and who has documented cases of what he describes as genuine supernatural possession alongside natural psychiatric illness, has written that disordered grief appears as one of the most consistent environmental factors in cases that escalate from minor disturbance to serious infestation or beyond. I am not citing him because the secular medical establishment validates Catholic doctrine. It does not need that validation, and I would not want you to think it did. I cite him because an observer with no theological commitment, trained in a completely different discipline, looking at the same cases from the outside, has noticed the same pattern. That convergence is not nothing. The technical classification I would apply to what was happening in that house falls under what we call infestation of place, combined with the early stages of oppression and external influence that had not crossed the threshold of obsession or possession, but that was pressing on the members of that household from a specific location. The mechanism was the disordered attachment of the living to a dead person, expressed materially as a sealed room and a preserved wardrobe, and maintained spiritually by the complete cessation of prayer for the dead man's soul. That last detail matters more than anything else I have said so far, and I want you to hear it clearly because it is the doctrinal heart of this entire discussion. The Church teaches since the Council of Florence in 1439, confirmed at Trent, that souls after death are in one of 3 states: heaven, purgatory, or hell. The majority of souls, even faithful souls in the state of grace at death, pass through purgatory, which is purification, not despair. It is the final preparation for the beatific vision, the burning away of the last attachments that stand between the soul and the sight of God. And the Church teaches as dogmatic certainty, not pious opinion, that the living can assist souls in purgatory through prayer, through the holy sacrifice of the Mass, through indulgences, through penance offered for their intention. This is why the Church has always prayed for the dead. The Requiem Mass, existing in the Roman Rite in developed form from at least the 9th century, is ordered entirely toward a specific soul. The Mass is the single most powerful act of intercession the Church possesses, because it is not merely a prayer. It is the representation of Calvary with the full weight of Christ's redemptive act applied to a specific intention. This woman had not offered a single Mass for her husband's soul in 11 months. She had not prayed a rosary for him. She had not received confession herself, which meant she had not been in the state of grace that the sacramental life requires, which meant her own prayers, such as they were weakened. She had not, in any meaningful sense, done the things the Church has always told the bereaved to do, because those things actually help the dead. What she had done instead was keep his shirts on their hangers, and somewhere in the logic of her grief, This felt like loyalty, like love, like the refusal to abandon him that she had promised him at the altar. But here is what she had not been taught, what almost no one in her parish had been taught because it had not been preached from a pulpit in her memory, that the way we grieve affects our ability to help the dead. A grief that refuses to release the dead, that turns their room into an unopened chamber, that cannot speak of them in the past tense without feeling the past tense as a betrayal, is a grief that is turned inward. It is no longer oriented toward the dead person's need. It is oriented toward the living person's inability to bear the loss. And those are very different things with very different spiritual consequences. I want to be precise here because I am not arguing that all grief is disordered. I am not arguing that keepsakes are dangerous. A photograph on the mantelpiece, a ring worn on a chain, a book he inscribed with a date and a small note in the margin. The Catholic tradition is not Calvinist. It does not strip the material world of meaning. We believe God works through matter, through water and oil and bread and the laying on of hands. The Church has always made room for the objects that carry memory and orient us toward love and gratitude and the hope of the resurrection. The question is not whether you keep something. The question is what the keeping does. Does it help you commend the soul to God? Does it move you toward prayer, toward Mass, toward the specific acts of intercession the Church has always used to help the dead, or does it substitute for those acts? Does it let you sit outside a closed door and feel His presence in there and call that presence and find in that act of calling a comfort that keeps you from doing the real work of helping Him reach heaven? That is the diagnostic. That is the line. And it is a line the modern church has almost entirely stopped drawing to the great harm of the living and the dead alike. I need to pause here and say what I always say in situations like this. I am a priest, not a prophet. I do not have the ability to look into a specific home and tell you whether a specific closet is a problem. I am describing a class of situations, a recognizable pattern that appears with enough consistency in cases that escalate to spiritual harm that I believe it must be named and addressed. What any individual person does with this information belongs to that person's conscience and to their confessor. That is where these decisions are made, in the dialogue between a soul and a qualified priest, not in a video. The process of addressing what was happening in that house took several months. It was not dramatic. There was no single confrontation, no single rite that resolved everything at once. There was a formal blessing of the home room by room with the longer traditional form, the Benedictio Domus, which invokes specific protection and asks for the driving out of any malign influence in explicit terms. There were prayers. There were 5 masses offered for the husband's soul specifically, intentionally, with the family present for each one. There was confession, the mother's confession, which she had not received since a month before her husband died, and which she had been avoiding not from defiance, but from a grief that had collapsed inward and taken her sacramental life with it. And there was the daughter's confession, which was harder because she had to fight through something to get there, a resistance that was not entirely her own. And there was the opening of the wardrobe. The mother did it herself. I did not open it. I stood in the doorway, and she went in, and she stood for long time with her hand on the sleeve of the brown cardigan. And then she moved through the shirts one by one. She set aside 2. One he had worn on their wedding anniversary, the last one before he became ill, and one she simply could not part with, a pale blue cotton he had liked in summer, frayed at the cuffs. Those she kept folded in a cedar box with a photograph taken the Christmas before he died. The rest she distributed to his brother, who needed a winter coat, to young man in the parish who had nothing warm for the cold season, to St. Vincent de Paul, which distributed to people she would never meet who needed what her husband had left. She did this over 3 Saturdays. She cried through all of it. When it was done, she went to daily Mass and offered it for him. And for the first time in 11 months, she said in the parking lot afterward that she felt something she could only describe as a lifting, not happiness, not resolution, just the sense that something that had been held in place had been allowed to move. The daughter recovered over the following 4 weeks. Not immediately, not in a single day, but incrementally. the way a room warms when you open the window. She came back to Mass on her own without being asked. She stopped sitting at her father's chair. She started talking again in her own voice about her own things, school, her friends, a book she was reading. The cold in the room dissipated, the heaviness in the hall. I cannot prove causation to any standard of scientific evidence. I am describing what the Church has understood for 2,000 years and what I have watched work consistently case after case in families where the living were willing to do the hard and holy thing of releasing the dead into God's hands and then doing the specific practical work of interceding for them. The Roman ritual of 1614 codified what the Church had already been doing for over a millennium. The 1999 revised rite De Exorcismis et Supplicationibus Quibusdam added conditions and language that have, in my professional assessment, made pastoral intervention more difficult without improving its theological precision. But what matters is not the administrative structure of the rite. What matters is the doctrine beneath it and the willingness to act on it. Now let me speak directly to you because I am aware that not everyone watching this is doing so out of academic interest. You have a room you do not open, or a closet or a drawer you have not touched since the funeral, or a box under the bed that contains something you have told yourself you are keeping out of love. And somewhere in you, in the honest part that is still listening for God's voice in the early morning, you know that you are not keeping it out of love. You are keeping it because releasing it would require you to admit something you are not ready to admit, that the person is gone, that death is real, that the place they occupied in your life cannot be held open indefinitely without cost. I am not telling you the object is magically dangerous. Fabric is fabric. A cardigan is wool and buttons. The danger is not in the cloth. The danger is in the posture of refusal, of holding on past the point where holding on is love into the territory where it is a kind of spiritual hoarding, keeping the presence of the dead as a substitute for doing the work of helping them. Ask yourself this: when did you last go to Mass for this person's soul? When did you last pray a rosary with their name in your intention? When did you last go to confession and in the state of grace offer something, anything for their purgatorial purification? If the answer is that you have not, and that you have been keeping their things instead, then I want you to understand what you have been doing. You have been giving yourself the feeling of connection without doing the thing that actually connects them to God. It is in its structure a very human mistake, and the Church has a name for it: disordered attachment, and it has a remedy. The remedy begins with the honest examination of what you are holding and why, not with throwing everything out, with asking of each thing whether it orients you toward heaven or whether it has become a place to stand still. A healthy keepsake helps you pray. It brings the person to mind in a way that moves you toward intercession, toward gratitude, toward the hope of reunion in Christ. A disordered shrine stops time. It keeps you in the room with them, not in conversation with God about them. The distinction is real, and it has consequences, and it is yours to discern with your confessor, with prayer, with honesty. Now, let me address what lies beneath all of this, because the situation this family found themselves in did not happen by accident. It happened within a specific cultural and ecclesial moment that made it much more probable than it would have been in another era. The catechetical collapse of the last 60 years is the context. I am not going to be polite about this, because the politeness has cost too much. After the Second Vatican Council, which ran from 1962 to 1965, there was a systematic dismantling of the doctrinal formation that had existed in the Catholic world since Trent. The Baltimore Catechism, which was clear and doctrinally precise, was largely abandoned. The teaching of purgatory became rare from the pulpit. The teaching of the demonic became rarer still. An entire generation of Catholics was formed, if formed is even the right word, without the vocabulary to understand what death means, what the soul is, what purgatory requires of the living, or what the enemy is doing in the spaces that grief and disorder open up. A 2019 survey by the Pew Research Center found that approximately 70% of Catholics in the United States do not believe in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Not a minority. 70%. This is not a peripheral belief. The real presence is the central doctrine of the Catholic faith. If you do not believe that Jesus Christ, body and blood, soul and divinity, is truly present in the consecrated host, you do not receive the Eucharist as the Church intends it. You receive bread, and you do not offer the Mass for a soul in purgatory with the understanding that what you are offering has infinite merit because Christ is present on that altar. You offer a gathering, a community moment, a symbol,